if you're serious about PCI, you need to get it right. And to get it right, you need to have a value-oriented partner.
That's one of those, again, another hidden piece of complexity when you're going down the compliance.
She's brand new. She's never done it before. So it feels like a new audit every year. You know your company, what really bothers you from a security perspective. A bad firm is not going to ask you about what those things are.
Welcome, everybody. This is Tuesday Morning Grind, episode number 56. Today we have a special episode where we are going to talk about how to get PCI DSS certified. So if you're a high-growth tech company, a startup company, a company that operates primarily in the cloud and AWS, Azure, GCP, or anything like that, we have a guest expert with us, Chris Donaldson, today, who's going to kind of give us the rundown on how to get certified if this is your first time or if you're thinking about switching providers and you want to know what to do there. So Chris Donaldson is our PCI Practice Manager expert here, going to talk us through it. Welcome, Chris. How are you?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing good, man. So let's start off. Just give everybody a quick background. Like, how does one get into PCI and become a PCI expert? How did you get into the space?
Yeah, good question. So PCI. So I started doing PCI. I guess it was seven or 8 years ago at this point. Got into security, and probably one of the best ways to, at the time, learn security is to actually do PCI. In particular, because it requires, such a wide, span of knowledge across all the security domains, except for availability and integrity. So, like not BCP or DR, but pretty much everything else in security that you could, need to learn. PCI gives you that opportunity to do so. So I was with a different company at the time. I was with PricewaterhouseCoopers at the time, working on, and had the opportunity to learn security programs, learn IT landscapes, infrastructure, some mostly Fortune 50 companies. Those companies as well have, and you may know this, and, the e-commerce side of things on those companies really is looking a lot more like, a startup. They're functioning more like startups, actually, just in terms of how agile they are and their DevSecOps approach. So got a good opportunity to learn both like legacy IT on-prem as well as, multi-cloud environments through that way. And so ended up being able to, become, we had a lot of success. Ended up helping lead the PCI practice at PwC before I exited and came to Risk 360.
Yep. Now we get all of your brain power. So Chris is what's called a QSA. So if you're brand new to PCI, you have to be a QSA firm and a QSA as an individual to be able to issue reports on compliance and PCI certification. So Chris is that. Like what's interesting about you is you worked on the complex of the complex in the Fortune 50. Most of our clients and most of the audience that listens to this is maybe not a startup, but definitely high growth tech in the service provider. So
sure,
which is nice because that actually makes it simple in some areas, but also complex in other areas where you have to rely on it. So we'll talk through that. So let's start at the beginning in terms of most people who are pursuing PCI certification are doing so because someone is making them.
Yep.
Like you don't go get PCI certified because you just want to.
Right.
So from your experience, like why is this even a thing? Why are companies being asked to do this?
Yeah. So there's really two for our, we'll call it for folks in the high growth tech space. There's really two reasons why PCI is going to come on your radar. Number one, and probably more common, possibly more common, is that a customer or there's some sort of customer's asking for it, a deal is dependent on it, a contract extension or renewal is dependent on it, or there's a market that you want to chase down, a market that you want to open up that requires you to be PCI compliant. The customer or the client, depending on how your organization is laid out, their third-party risk management process, one of the check boxes is that you're PCI level 1 compliant.
Yep.
I would say less frequently. I see that they just require to be PCI compliant in general, and more now I'm seeing that clients are being required to be PCI level 1 compliant.
Yep.
Which is it's a distinction for sure, and there's a difference to being just compliant versus level 1 compliant.
Yeah, a lot of our clients are B2B SaaS providers. So if you're listening to this and it sounds like you, maybe you're doing business with a bank or a retailer or something like that, and you're like, why in the world are they asking me to be PCI compliant? They're the ones who need to be PCI compliant. But there's this phenomenon in PCI where those to be PCI compliant, you also have to make sure that any third parties in your ecosystem that are managing payments are also PCI compliant. So it trickles all the way down to you. So in order to keep your customer happy and maintain your contract, ultimately, you also have to be PCI compliant.
Yeah.
And that's when you have to engage with a third party like Risk360 or some other QSA firm to kind of navigate that process. So bottom line is it's in line with revenue. If you want to do business with that customer base, you have to be PCI compliant.
Yeah.
You mentioned there's 2 reasons. What's the other reason?
Yeah, the other one is when we're seeing this more as companies kind of transition out of like the just making it happen phase to there's actual risk to manage. Board of directors and investors in particular, they want to make sure their investment is protected. And one of the best ways to do that for organizations that have maybe historically done a PCI self-assessment questionnaire or an SAQ is they'll require them to have a third party come in and assess their PCI landscape against the PCI DSS level 1 compliance standard. And so that will give the board of directors and investors the confidence that they want that, a misconfigure, there's not security risk in the organization that's going to compromise their investment.
Yeah, we're seeing that. I think that's a driver of many compliance frameworks, PCI, SOC 2, ISO, and others, but certainly in PCIs, we're seeing a lot of our customers either thinking about acquiring another company or being acquired themselves.
Yep.
And because of all the breaches, ransomware, everything else, cybersecurity is becoming a key element of that due diligence phase.
Yep.
And like you said, they're saying, how do I let the board or my investor or my acquirer feel confident?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So some people are watching this. They say, all right, I'm ready to get started. I know I have to do it. Someone's mandating that I do this. So can you walk us through, like, what is the process, the steps to become PCI certified?
Sure. So the best first step is to do a little bit of introspection and make sure you're very clear on why you want to get PCI compliant and what the value of PCI compliance is to your organization. If the only value to your organization is that you want to be able to put it on your website, right, or throw the PCI compliant decal on the website, you are going to take a very different set of steps versus if you are looking to unlock revenue, if you're looking to address an ask from your board or from a set of investors, if you're trying to confidently, eyes wide open, enter a market segment or have a product go out. It's just a different set of things you're going to care about, and different set of providers that you're going to look to use. The first thing that so to circle back to answer your question, the first thing that you really going to want to do is to after you've identified the value, is to identify a partner to move forward with from a QSA perspective.
Well, actually, let me back you up here because I didn't actually think that was the first step we were going to talk about, but it makes a lot of sense. The first step is what's the business case here, right? Like you mentioned, because some people just think, hey, I want the decal, I want the logo on my website, I want it on my marketing material. I heard about PCI, so I just want to do that. But there's going to be costs associated with that, and effort, and technology, and time, monetary. So you kind of need to do a business case to say, what's the value to my organization to do this? Is this going to help me suddenly enter a brand new market and serve a lot of new customers? Is it going to really reduce my security risk to such an extent that it's going to save my company's butt if we have a security breach or prevent one entirely? And also getting the leadership on board with that, because sometimes what we see is, there was a CTO or an engineer or a compliance person that was asked to go get this framework, but they didn't escalate that up to leadership. They didn't build a business case. So I like that as a first step. It's like, do some introspection and figure out if this is really something you want to get into, And if you want to get into it, are you going to dive in both feet and do it right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is this something you kind of want to, I won't say do wrong, but do a lighter version of it? Maybe do a self-assessment, download an Excel spreadsheet, and just kind of see where you measure up. And those are going to be two different strategies.
Yeah, they're absolutely different strategies.
And then assuming that you really want to dive in, there's business value on the table here.
Mm-hmm.
Then you got to start thinking about a partner, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to need a guide, and you're definitely going to need a third party to give you the attestation. So where do you do that? Okay, I have a business case. I need a guide.
Yeah. So, and that kind of goes back to the whole value question, right? So if there's very little value outside of, having the decal, your expectations should be very low, right? In terms of the partner that you go for, right? Because it doesn't mean that much to you. But PCI, and this, PCI can be very challenging. There are, to become level 1 compliant, doing a report on compliance, there are, over 300 individual controls. The ROC, report on compliance, the template for that alone is over, is very, very long. There's just a lot of documentation required. So what that means is that if you're serious about PCI, if it unlocks revenue, if there's risk mitigation, you need to get it right. And to get it right, you need to have a value-oriented partner. To contrast with maybe a cost leader in the space, right? There's two different things you're going to get, two totally different things you're going to get, right? On the one hand, when you go with a value leader, your expectations, as the company should be that you have a partner, right? They're going to sit down with you. They're going to spend the time to scope your environment correctly. They're going to spend time to teach you what PCI is, right? So you're not entirely dependent upon them to, divine the security objectives and how PCI works and everything like that out of the standard. They're going to help you think through, remediation. They're going to help you think through, how to strategically orient your program to, minimize your scope and to maximize what the money that you actually invest operating your program. They're going to help you also achieve your business goals. They're going to have your business goals first and foremost.
I think an important thing to point out here is it's not intuitive to everyone, where the cost comes when you're talking about PCI. Mm-hmm. So operating under the assumption that you have to do PCI, you have to do it correctly. Right. Most of the cost isn't associated with the firm right. Risk 360 that you might hire. That's going to be some piece of the cost, but most of the true cost comes with, how much infrastructure am I going to have to implement or change from an IT perspective? How much time of my people is this going to take? How much toil is this going to create in terms of stress and me thinking about it and being distracted? And when it comes to selecting a partner on this thing, you have one type that I'll negatively call the check the box auditor. They're going to come in, they're going to say, are you doing it or you don't? And if it's no, then they're going to put an X, and they're not going to provide a lot of advisory on where to go next. Mm-hmm. So for most companies, that's not extremely valuable, because they usually have to start over. How many clients have we had that had to start over because they went one route, didn't get the advice they need, and then come to us? Yeah. Then you have, I would say, a guide, the partner that is the guide. I'd brand us that way. That's going to come through and say, all right, what is your partner expectations? How should we scope this thing? What is the most efficient and effective way for us to put controls and technology in place that fit into your existing environment, but also get the job done, et cetera? Answer all those types of questions. Do orientation sessions where we train people on PCI and what to expect and how to get through the audit. And then that ultimately reduces the cost of the total compliance initiative significantly, because now they know what to do, how to do it efficiently. Now, assuming someone, they figure out their trusted advisor selection, they pick a firm, what are they looking at in terms of process then? All right, they've engaged Risk 360 or some other QSA firm. Sure. What's the process look like to become certified after that?
Yeah, so I would for sure, when you first start, right, make sure that you and your QSA are aligned on your business objectives. Your QSA should, assuming you go with a guide, right, type QSA and not a check the box QSA. Again, if you're going with a check the box QSA, adjust your expectations accordingly. Just because it's not fair to them to have different expectations when you're when they are functioning as a check the box QSA. But if you're going with a guide, right, make sure spend the time, and your QSA should do this without you having to ask. But if they don't ask or they don't set this up and take the initiative here, then it's incumbent on you to take the initiative here. But your business objectives, where you're going, and your security risk landscape should be very explicit between and an open set of conversation points between you and your QSA. That should kind of lead the conversation. It should lead the effort from the get-go, right? Because the way that it's going to flow after that is your QSA should, again, this is the should, what they should be doing, is they should sit down and they should have a scoping exercise with you, meaning they work through data flows, they work through network diagrams, they unpack your IT stack, right? If you're hybrid, if you're on-prem, if you're cloud, single cloud, multi-cloud, like whatever and then whatever your stack is inside of there, they should get pretty intimate with how how your operation or how your IT landscape is set up, how your processes work, and all moving towards how do you interact with card data, or what service are you providing to some PCI merchant, right? Some PCI your customer that could potentially impact their PCI data, right? What are they depending on you for?
Yep, and this might not be intuitive to the first time PCI kind of shopper, someone who's looking for PCI for the first time, but this scoping piece you're talking about is essential because what PCI says is that I think that the words they use are anything that stores, transfers, or touches card data ultimately is in scope. Mm-hmm. So if you don't have your network set up, what a word that you might hear is segmented or segmentation, everything in your company could be in scope, which blows out your cost structure and how you have to secure everything. So a good QSA is going to coach you to segment the network and really limit your the scope of your overall PCI initiative. And that's going to help you out from how much money you have to spend on infrastructure, what is actually audited, your audit burden, the number of individuals and resources. So that's a key first step that's often glanced over because you have sometimes it feels natural just to treat every environment the same. But the very first thing you want to do is really limit that environment and tighten it up.
Yeah, and your QSA should really help you. I mean, they should help you, one, think through your scoping, your current scope. And they should be really candid with you, like if there's opportunities to reduce your PCI scope and how you can go about doing that. There's a lot of implications to over-scoping an environment, like for obvious reasons, but if they're not so obvious, right, it's just a very expensive, it's just very expensive, both from an FTE point of view, as well as an OpEx point of view, as well as a CapEx point of view. It just gets expensive all across the board. And two, there's a lot of implications to underscoping as well, because you are not taking into account, you're effectively removing the security assessment from a portion of your environment. Yep. And it doesn't. Generally, right? What my experience is, and probably your experience as well, is that if it's not part of the PCI scope, then it's generally not part of some other scope. Just because it's not on people's radar, and if it's not on people's radar, it probably hasn't been looked at in a little while. And the implications of that from a risk perspective,
I agree. I think scoping is the single most important part of the whole engagement because that's what PCI is an annual audit. You have to do it every year. Mm-hmm. So if you think about your 5-year cost here, getting that scope reduced up front is going to impact you for years to come. So it's essential to get right. So if you're lost here, let's recap the scope. So first thing, do a business case, do some introspection, make sure it's worth your time, what kind of strategy you want to do. Then if you decide, hey, look, I really have to do PCI, this is central to our business strategy, go out and select a QSA. Quality matters when it comes to picking a QSA because there is a lot of advisory attached to being a QSA in addition to the audit. Yep. Once you select that auditor, step number 1 is what we call scoping. We're going to scope that environment. We're going to get it tight. We're going to make sure that it's not too small. It's the Goldilocks zone, not too big, not too small. Going to set you up for success into the future. So after you've agreed on scope, what's next?
So your QSA is going to, after you've agreed on scope, they should give you, and maybe just to wrap up the scoping portion, they should hand you some sort of statement or document that says, hey, here's a scope, right? Here is your, company A, right? Here's your scope. Consequently, here's what we're going to go assess from a PCI perspective. That's really important because it just makes sure that everyone's on the same page with what's going to be assessed versus what's not going to be assessed. It eliminates confusion and rework later in the process, and it gives you a very good, confident leg to stand on as you talk to your board or your investors or whomever else, right? So that's So now we've wrapped scoping. Your QSA is going to go back and they're going to prepare some sort of list of document requests or evidence requests, artifact requests. You can call it. People call them a lot of different things, which they're going to share with you as part of like their assessment prep, effort, right? What you're going to experience is two things, right? One is you're going to experience a set of interview requests or walkthrough requests are going to come over from your QSA. Depending on the QSA and how they've kind of bundled them, expect and budget for, probably 10 to 20 different meetings, maybe more. Hopefully it's not fewer than 10 in your first year of working with that QSA. They may bundle some things differently, but it'll be around there. Additionally, they'll send over a list of evidence requests or artifacts, which are going to be, span of, different things they're going to ask for, whether it be documents, policies and procedures, configuration standards. They may ask for user access lists or actual configurations on systems, firewall rule sets, pen test results, vulnerability scan results. There's a myriad of things that are going to come across in that list.
Yeah, we typically call that readiness because I think what most of our clients are wondering, I got my scope, but then they look at this rock that you mentioned is like 100 pages long and there's 300 requirements. And those requirements are kind of written for an expert. Mm-hmm. So it's not immediately obvious, like, how do I comply with all of these different requirements? And that's where that QSA comes in that you're talking about here is based on those requirements. We're going to translate that into stuff you have to give the auditor to pass the audit, which will be an evidence request list. So you might hear that's like an auditor term. Mm-hmm. They might call it an IRL or an evidence request list, and an audit artifact list or whatever it might be. And they're going to say, hey, here's the 100 things you have to give us to pass the audit. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, you're not going to have a lot of those things if you're going for it the first time. So you have to get into that creation stage. But that readiness phase, I think, is what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. And here's probably one of the biggest, reasons why going with a, we'll call it a check the box auditor is, or assessor makes it makes a lot of work on the company, on the client, whoever's being assessed, because if they're not going to hold your hand, or they're not going to tailor the requests to you, you as, responding to all these requests are going to have to figure out what in the heck, this generic evidence request means, and what specifically do I need to hand over to you for you to call whatever, to actually make sure can assess whatever you're trying to actually assess, right?
Yeah.
They're probably just going to replay or turn the PCI control into a question, and you're going to have to figure out, okay, what specifically do you want? Like, how much of it do you want?
They'll say something like, hey, provide evidence that your network segmented. And you're like, what's segmentation and how do I provide that evidence?
That's exactly.
So it makes it really difficult. That's like one of those insider things. Imagine doing your taxes and your tax guy's like, okay, well, shoot me over your tax ID and evidence that you did your R&D tax credit last year and this and this. And you're like, what? I don't even know what that means. How do I provide you that?
Yeah.
That's really difficult. Whereas a good advisor is going to get in there with you, help you strategize, figure out how to do it. And that's how that all is connected to readiness. Mm-hmm. So what's kind of the outcome of readiness, Chris? Like you've made this request list. They're not going to have stuff. Like, what's the whole point of that?
The whole point of readiness is a QSA specifically can start understanding what's in place from a compliance perspective, what's not in place. What do they need to actually do? We'll call it a double click on, right? What do they need to dive into? They found out, hey, you have this VPC. You have a set of VPCs, and that are in multiple availability zones, these different kinds of architecture, there's different kinds of infrastructure across those AZs, and doing different things. And okay, I need to ask for samples now for all this stuff, for these different kinds of things that I found out are actually in your environment, because I found out you configure, your Windows infrastructure differently, between, or you configure your, Unix infrastructure in this particular way. So I got to go dive into that to make sure you're following your own rules there.
This is about the time I think people who are thinking about doing PCI, they're like, man, this is going to be complicated. So I'm going to plug some stuff that we do at Risk 360 to alleviate some of that concern. Because we realize, like, as you're going through this, like, these are the exact things that come up. They're complicated. Give me a policy. Well, I don't have a policy. Give me your configuration settings. Well, I don't know what the configuration settings should be.
Yep.
And some of the things that we've done is, one, we have this platform called Phalanx. So all of those requests, we've taken the time to translate from the in-readable content that PCI provides that's written for the expert, and we've translated that into human-readable format. So really anyone with even a little bit of technical acumen can basically understand what they need. So when we send over those requests for the first time, they're human-readable. You know what we're looking for. The second thing we do is, as we go through readiness and your company has gaps, like you don't have a policy, you don't know what we're looking for, we have resources available. So that's where we have like tons of policy templates, examples, previous evidence type examples, templates for what things should look like. And so as Chris and myself, our team's going through this stuff and we're identifying gaps, we're throwing over the bow resources for you to start remediating immediately. So hopefully we're decomplicating an otherwise very complicated process for a customer. And then you have an expert like Chris and others that know all the nuances. Hey, this is how you have it configured. Well, here's some alternatives we've seen that can help you become PCI compliant. So hopefully that's alleviating some concerns people may have, because it certainly is that's one of those, again, another hidden piece of complexity when you're going down the compliance journey.
Yeah, and one of the things that's very tempting to do, or that a lot of assessors tend to do, especially the ones who are probably cost leaders, or check the box PCI assessors, right? I mean, you call them what you want to, but is they do not keep like the risk objective or the actual security objective in mind as they go through this, pretty dense standard, right? It's very, whatever the language is how, what they need to see. And I think one of the strong benefits that, we bring to the table, right, is we're very, security. What's the objective here? Like, how do you achieve the objective? Right? What do we actually need to see to make sure the risk is mitigated versus what PCI says explicitly? Is your environment just doing things a little bit differently, right? But you're still mitigating the risk. You're still addressing the objective, and that allows our clients to not have to retrofit their environment to meet what PCI says, while still maintaining like the security risk mitigation that they need to be compliant.
Yep, for sure. So we get through readiness, meaning that we've spot checked evidence, we provided resources to help them get through remediation. Ultimately, you get a report, a readiness assessment report that says, like, here's all the things you're doing really well. Here's the handful of things you got to fix. Here's the resources to fix those. Then the client goes and presumably fixes those issues during remediation to be able to become PCI certified. Then they're ready for the live audit. What does the live audit look like?
So the live audit is going to be, probably a differential assessment, right, based off of what we had in the readiness, right? So PCI, maybe just for a little bit of education, PCI is a year time frame, right? So you have to whatever you've defined as your testing period can't be less than a year, or can't be more than a year. Pardon me. So you need to show compliance with the configuration, with the controls, during the assessment period, and that can be that can be and documents can be live, can be good for a year, most of them. So what you're going to need to see is, for all the things that you didn't have in place, right, you're going to have to retest those, right? Additionally, what you may do is you may pull different samples, and you're going to more than likely do a little more of a deep dive on when you come back for the actual live assessment portion of things. Now, in the readiness assessment, if you covered a lot of ground, a lot of that evidence, if it was good, can be retained, assuming the time frame lines up. But the live audit is going to result in potentially a few additional gaps identified, right? Because the level of detail potentially a little bit more in some areas. It's going to look at also if anything changed, right? So if you added a whole new set of functionality, if your architecture changed between the readiness assessment and the actual audit, it'll take a look at that as well. And just as maybe a side note for anybody, if you have significant architectural changes that are on the way, communicate that to your QSA up front so that they can plan accordingly. I would even recommend that they help you think through and or talk through whether it be a CAB or whatever your architecture review board process is, your documentation prior to that going out, so that once your change has gone in, there's no surprises. And your QSA has already functionally signed off on the security of the environment if it's going to be PCI compliant, so you don't have to do rework. The culmination of the audit or the assessment is going to be in what's called a report on compliance. And this is what we've been talking about throughout the program, that there's a pretty hefty report that PCI requires. Depending on your environment and the size of your environment, it's going to be no less than probably 200 pages. Some are much longer than that, depending on how much content there is and how big your environment is. But it's a very robust report that covers quite a bit of security, quite a few security domains and requirements.
Yep. So how I think of the audit, especially first year, is the audit itself is finishing the drill on readiness. Like you said, there were gaps during readiness. As the client resolves those gaps, they're going to provide the evidence that they resolved them. We're going to finish the drill on the audit. The thing that you as the client being audited don't know is happening is we're doing documentation of every piece of evidence that comes through in a document called a ROC, or report on compliance. That's that 200-page document that Chris, you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You will get that as a client. You'll get a ROC. You'll get that 200-page document. You will probably never read that entire document, and you probably won't provide that to most of your clients. There may be some that you do provide that to. The other piece of documentation that you'll get is called an attestation of compliance, or an AOC. That's like a summary, basically saying for each domain, pass, fail. And you will provide that to your client. And collectively, that's what is called PCI certification. Yep. So there's ROC and AOC. ROC stands for report on compliance. AOC is attestation. AOC is attestation of compliance. So those are the deliverables. Mm-hmm. So what's the follow-on? All right, I'm a customer. I've been through the audit. What do I need to think about to maintain this thing? Yeah.
So on an ongoing basis, there's a pretty decent set of controls that PCI require you to maintain on year round. Once you've started your PCI compliant clock, right, or you've decided to file for compliance, assume you're going to continue filing next year and the year after. There's a handful of things that have to be maintained and done every single year throughout the year. So I would already go ahead and budget for those things, right? So things like reviewing your, twice a year, reviewing your firewall rule sets, and cleaning those up. 4 times a year, you have to do, or quarterly rather, you have to do both external vulnerability scans and as well as internal vulnerability scans. If you're a service provider, which I think most of the folks listening to this are going to be service providers, you need to do segmentation tests, segmentation penetration tests, as well as penetration, regular penetration tests, once or twice a year, depending on your specific scope, right?
Yep. So, and I'll plug Risk 360 again. It's becoming an ad for us. It's our podcast, so I guess I can do that.
Yeah.
One of the things that we do is, we have that platform Phalanx I'm talking about. So within that, we have something called Compliance Calendar, where we've built out a template for every recurring thing that happens in PCI. You mentioned a few of them, like vulnerability scans quarterly, pen testing annually, plus segmentation once a year. And then you do, there's others, quarterly user access review, I think is one of them. There's a bunch of them. Yep. So we have all those lists, and you can download that list. You can sync that list to your Outlook or Google Calendar to kind of be an accountability partner to make sure you do that. Risk 360 also provides complementary services. So, for example, we have Renegade Labs that does pen testing and the segmentation testing. We do vulnerability scanning and ASV scanning. So hopefully, if you use a firm like Risk360 or you use us, there's an abundance of tools to help you maintain the program after the audit is done. We also have a guy on our team who leads customer success named Kendall. So that's where what we've chosen to do, because we found it effective, is getting our customer success team involved with our audit clients to help be that accountability partner in between audits, just to check in and be like, hey, man, don't forget you got quarterly activities coming up. Don't forget to use Phalanx to do that. Because what I've found, and Chris, you've probably seen this too, is these companies put a huge amount of effort into becoming PCI compliant that first year.
Mm-hmm.
Then turnover happens, or you kind of take your foot off the gas because you need a break, and then all the controls fall apart, and that really hurts you the second year. Whereas if you can put some structures in place to maintain that program year over year, it's a lot easier for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that's a great point. The other thing that, makes it hard is keeping track of what was submitted the previous year, right? So that, for most clients, I'm thankful that, Risk360 kind of bridges this gap. But for most clients, they're having to, their QSA is not going to provide them what was submitted last year. It's going to feel like a net new audit every year because there's turnover, because things change, right? Or because Jimmy helped lead the PCI audit last year, and Jimmy left. So now you have Glenn or Judy who's running it this year, and she's brand new. She's never done it before, so it feels like a new audit every year, and it's very fatiguing. Phalanx, which is one of the wonderful things about Phalanx, and yeah, this is potentially turning into an ad for Risk360, which is great. Because Phalanx actually solves a lot of those issues in that it retains, evidence that was submitted in previous years for reference. It retains some of those evergreen documents, and it facilitates, okay, what was the scope from last year? Okay, what did we assess against last year? Why did we do from last year? And so so clients don't have to be as concerned about if there's turnover or if people just decide to change roles. It helps maintain and facilitate continuity from year over year to where the client really isn't the client is the company itself. It's the IT, it's the PCI environment versus it being the particular person that you worked with one year, which changes to the next year.
Yeah. Judy drug us across the finish line, but we'll never be able to do it again. That's right. That's just not a great situation to be in. So I have a couple rapid fire questions too, because I know folks there's specific questions I want to make sure we get to, because this is what people really want. Timing. How long? Let's talk about first year. I've never been PCI certified before. How long should I budget for that to take?
Yeah, plan for 12 weeks and plan for it to take about 75 to 95 FTE hours of folks' time. Just go ahead and assume it's going to take, like I said, 75 to 95 person hours to facilitate that assessment. If you have somebody riding along, obviously it's going to be more, but 12 weeks is a good on the outside bet there. If your remediation is remediation's a lot, you can spend a ton of time doing remediation if you're slow, but if you keep on it, 12 weeks is a good number.
Yeah, just based on seeing a lot of the same types of clients, I'll give two scenarios. Let's assume that you're cloud-based and you have nothing. Like you've never written a policy before, but you've built everything in cloud and you feel pretty good about it.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, I would say like 6 months is probably a good time, because you got to write all those policies. You're going to go through readiness and everything. And typically, in 6 months, you can be pretty darn ready, especially with a good partner.
Yep.
Now, if you are doing a little self-assessment and you're like, we are complex as heck, we got stuff all over the place, we're a multi-cloud environment, we're growing fast, we have tons of other priorities, and I need to set some expectations with my board, then maybe go on the 12-month side of it, give yourself a year to fix it. But most of our clients fall in that 12-month to a year time frame. Some of them do it a lot faster if they're a little simpler or they're more ready. Some could take a little longer if they're really, really complex. But that's a good, I think, time frame. And then you said between 75 and 95 person hours.
So maybe I was talking about the actual assessment versus all the remediation that's going to be required and standing up the program. So maybe let me rephrase my question. I absolutely agree with you. If we're talking about the end to end, I have nothing to PCI compliant, 6 months is a lot more appropriate. For the assessment itself, right? That's what that's what I would say plan for from scoping or original, initial kickoff to a rock, whether it's a compliant rock or not, right? That's where I would say plan for 12 weeks.
Yep.
And for
and that's how I interpreted what you said. That makes sense. Yeah. The audit itself, 75 to 95, that feels right to me too.
Yep.
So let's talk about cost.
Mm-hmm.
So let's break up costs just so everyone's clear that there are hidden costs to PCI. Now I'm just going to name a few and then we can talk about how much some of this stuff costs. One is, and this is monetary cost. I'm not going to include effort on this, but monetary cost. One is you might have to buy new tools to become PCI certified. So maybe you have to do some add-ons to AWS or Azure, or maybe you have to do this or that. I'm not going to include those in this because that's wildly variable for most of our clients. However, if you're in a cloud environment, the good news is there's typically pretty easy or pretty simple tack-ons in those environments to achieve PCI compliance.
Yep.
So you're at an advantage there. But the monetary cost, won't include that one, but just know that might be there. Probably not crazy though, especially if you're already in a cloud environment.
Mm-hmm.
Second thing is you have to get a penetration test from a third party.
Yep.
So you got to pay a consulting firm. Risk 360 does this. You have to, if you're not already doing this, you have to do vulnerability scans.
Mm-hmm.
We usually bundle that into the cost of our PCI engagement. And then you have to pay the auditor themselves to do the audit. So those are kind of third-party consultant costs you need to consider. I'll talk about the first two. So a pen test, a penetration test plus annual segmentation testing. If you're just looking for a minimum viable pen test that's going to get you compliant, depending on your complexity, I mean, it's going to be somewhere between 15 and 35K. Probably. You could go, if you want to do complex stuff and do more stuff, it can go a lot higher than that. If you have a really simple environment, it's going to be on the lower end, but somewhere in that range, you're going to have to do vulnerability scanning. We've seen companies purchase Nessus or Tenable.io or Qualys or something like that. Those are pretty affordable, somewhere in the ballpark of $2,500 to $10K a year. They're not terribly expensive. ASV scan means approved scanning vendor. So you have to use an approved scanning vendor. If you're using Risk 360, we bundle that cost and service into our PCI engagements. So I actually don't know what those costs outside of doing it with us, but just for us, we bundle it in. And I'll leave this one to you, Chris. If can you give a range, like from a very simple client to a more complex? What is the typical range for getting the certification itself?
Yeah, so I'll go back to the rubber stamp versus the value, we'll call it a value provider, right? So rubber stamp, again, adjust expectations accordingly. You can find an assessment or you can find a provider that's going to do an assessment from 10 grand on the really, really low end for a super simple environment, all the way up to maybe for a super complex environment, maybe 50. That's on the rubber stamp side. If you're looking for a value provider, your expectation should be probably 35 to 40 on the low end for a super simple environment. If you're super, super complex, I'm using the word super a lot, so we'll call it extraordinarily complex, with a lot of different caveats, a lot of different processes. 75 to 100 maybe appropriate for your environment.
Yeah. And complex has a lot of variables. And yourself, if you are a Fortune 10 company, you know that yours is going to be a lot more than 75 or 100. But for the typical, like for what we're talking about, the typical cloud-based high growth tech firm, I think that's a fair range. And what I recommend is now you have to go get a budget approved, or you have to take it to your executive team. So I like to use those ranges. Say, hey, pen tests, low end 15, high end 35. PCI certification itself, low end 35, high end 75. And you kind of know, if you're listening to this, you know your environment. Yeah. So if you're more complex, go to the high end. If you're less complex, go to low end.
Yep.
But take that range to your team and say, like, from a budget perspective, annual budget perspective, here's the range. And that's probably what it'll be. And you can get a decent provider at those costs.
Yes.
Like with anything, if it's too good to be true and it seems rock bottom prices, we're probably going to get rock bottom services because they just don't have the time allocated to do that kind of advisory.
Yeah.
But there could be situations where, like, you have an incredible internal team and you have Chris Donaldson on your team as a full-time employee.
Mm-hmm.
So you can go get that really low cost provider because you don't need that kind of advisory.
Yep.
So there's legitimate situations where that makes sense. Most of our clients don't have that. So, they're looking for a little bit more advisory, kind of a middle of the road cost. So that's how you can budget it. I wrote down a couple other ones. We talked about a QSA firm a little bit, and we've referred to them, and we get questions a lot around this. I'm going to ask the question, how do I know a good QSA firm when I see one? But the way I'm going to ask that is, what does a bad QSA firm look like? So if I'm out there shopping around for QSA firms, like, how do I know this is probably not a good one?
Yeah. So a couple of things. These may or may not be the ones you're thinking about, but off of my head, right? They're not going to ask you about your business objectives. They're not going to ask you about your security risk landscape that you know about, right? That you feel. And you know your company, right? Or you should know your security risk landscape, like what really bothers you from a security perspective, right? So they're a bad firm is not going to ask you about what those things are. It's going to feel like they're on a different side of the table of you. Like if you're in the conversation, it's going to feel like they're an opposition force.
Yeah, like you're an FBI. You got a light in your eyes, and they're scrutinizing your every word.
Like they're
very
not
confrontational.
Exactly. They're not going to feel like a partner. They're not going to feel like you're both moving towards the same objective. It's going to feel antagonistic because it is, more than likely. Other hallmarks of probably not the best QSA firm, right, to work with is they don't tailor things to your environment, right? They don't spend the time to get to know your environment and your specific use cases. And you feel that in the questions that you're asked, you feel that in the walkthroughs, that it could have been any company that gave these answers, right? It could have, this is not necessarily just us, right? This could be anybody. A really good firm, you're going to feel like your QSA knows your company and knows what you have going on and knows how exactly your stack works. And why you do something this way versus this way. They're gonna ask those questions.
I know a few things that on the other side of that we try to do, and I see the best firms do is, whatever your tech stack is, there are experts in that. So like we have chosen consciously to be kind of like cloud tech experts. Like if you're in AWS, Azure, GCP, and you're in a modern tech stack using Jira and Confluence and DevSecOps, we just know that world pretty well. So we can advise really well in that world. We have lots of thought leadership. So if you're asking questions like, how much does this cost? Or how much should I expect this to take? Or do you have templates? Or what are my 10 tool options to solve this problem? That's stuff that we can bring to the table. And if someone's looking at you and their eyes are glossing over and they don't know what to say, or they at least can't find someone in their firm to help you with that problem, those are indicators of problems. And those are kind of questions I would be asking during the vetting process. Like before you hire the firm, ask them if they can provide you some of that stuff, and they should be able to do that pretty easily. And then a tool like Phalanx, like that's icing on the cake too. So those are some of the things I wrote down that I was thinking. I do want to plug one thing before we wrap. And Chris, you have written a PCI ebook. Yep. So it's kind of a written format of a lot of what we've talking through here. So as a takeaway, if you want something to hand off to your executive team or you want to do some further research, 2 things that you can do. One, you can go download the PCI ebook on our website. You can go to risk360.com. There's a resources tab, and there's you can go to PCI and you can download the ebook there. There's a link for that. I'll put one in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. The other thing that you can do is if you like to watch stuff or hear it via audio instead of reading something, go to our YouTube channel and look up our playlist called PCI DSS, and there's videos that we've put out on PCI. Or you can visit our website and go to the resources tab, and those videos are also there. So you can watch videos on PCI, or you can read the ebook. We also have some white papers, and there's some stuff that will just help with that self-education as you're trying to figure out if this journey is appropriate for you. Mm-hmm. So, Chris, thanks very much for your time, sharing all your knowledge today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Hey, thank you for watching Tuesday Morning Grind podcast. If you like content just like this from cybersecurity executives, thought leaders, hackers, then come on over to risk360.com. Check out our resource center where we have blog posts, white papers, videos, all for free that can teach you about cybersecurity. If you want to know more about cybersecurity certifications like ISO 27001, SOC 2, PCI, High Trust, and others. We have a ton of content on that. So whatever you're looking for, we have a lot of resources. Head on over to risk360.com, shoot us a note, and we look forward to keeping the conversation going.